Hello. What I'd like to talk about today is the difference between intent, will, and agency. The reason why I think this is important is that it explains things like conspiracy. It explains things like why people are afraid of machines. And it explains some of the weird theories that people are coming up with how the world works and why politics is maybe more important than it actually is, and basically why these weird hypotheses aren't working out for people. So that confusion is what's causing that, the confusion between intent, will, and agency, and I hope to demonstrate that here. Why is this really important? Well, because we need a healthy understanding of these concepts. We need them disambiguated, pulled apart a little bit, because we're conflating them, we're equivocating on them. We're tying them all together in a weird way that causes us confusion. It causes us conspiratorial thinking. It causes us to think there's some machine in the way of our lives, or maybe that capitalism is preventing us from doing something. And because things like machines have agency, we think they have will. They're deliberately pointing us in a direction, and that's just a failure of us properly separating, these concepts from one another. So, how do we understand intent? Well, intent is something like what you think will happen if you enact, right, or give agency to your will, right? So if you think that you can apply your will to something, that will have a specific outcome, like making somebody else happy, or making you money, or getting you a job, or making sure you have the perfect grilled cheese, right? That's your intent, right? So it's the outcome you think will happen if you apply yourself, basically. And it's the beginning of a chain of action, right? Although it's not the only way action comes about, right? Some of your actions are unintentional, right? A lot of your actions are involuntary. Involuntary actions can't be intentional by definition. So it's important to know. And the important thing about this, the beginning of this chain, is we often try to infer intent from an action, right? But our intent is imperfect and doesn't always result in an action that results in something that we thought it would, right? That happens to us all the time. Make a bad prediction. If I do this person will be happy. Oops, they're crying. Oops, that's not good, right? This sort of thing happens all the time, and yet we routinely think we can tell from the actions in the world what the person's intent is. Now, under very specific circumstances, you can absolutely do that. This isn't actually that hard, although you can't do it from a single sampling of an action, for example. So that's good and important to know. But you can do it in certain cases. But those cases are very specific. And this is why conspiracies end up happening, right? We see something happen and we go, oh, they must have meant to do that all along. And there's a lot that goes into an action beyond intent before we get to the action part. And that's why conspiracies aren't a good way to understand the world, right? It's just not reliable. It's not a reliable way to understand intent. And many things are the result of second order effects, right? Constraints and patterns outside of what the agent is aware of. Right? And so you can intend to take over the world all you want, and you can make all the steps that should result in taking over the world, and still fail at taking over the world. You can also intend to make the world a better place and give everybody full freedom and end up taking over the world, right? Because maybe someone has to run the world. Maybe. And maybe it's important who or what or how, right? Maybe those things are important. And the fact that that is the way the world is not important because there's nothing you can do about it. And so whenever you see an action, you can't just link it directly to a single intent. And you can't link it directly to someone's will, which is going to be the next step in this chain. And we talk about this stuff all the time. There's a bunch of stuff that goes on outside of what you're aware of happening, right? Just tons of things are happening right now that you're not even aware of. And we do discuss this, right? We talk about, saints like Anthony of the Desert, right? And he didn't intend to found the monastic movement, but that's what happened, right? He was just trying to live by himself in the desert. Sure, fair enough, right? A lot of leaders didn't intend to lead anything or anyone, but they did, right? It just kind of happened. And some of them were reluctant to, take over the reins, and that caused disaster, right? And some of them weren't, and that caused disaster. Right? And some of them did just fine and did the right thing and were well remembered. I mean, all of these are possible. And we can look at other things, like we can look at artistic intent, right? With something like modern art, and we can say it's intentionally ugly. And that's true. It's intentionally ugly, right? You can intend to go to the gym, right? You can intend to stick to that diet. You can intend to avoid social media. You can intend not to drink that alcohol. So what you'll notice is it's not just things that require work or effort that you intend to do that go horribly wrong. It's also your intention not to put time, energy, and attention or work or effort into something that also fail, which is a little strange, right? So it's not a laziness issue per se. Laziness is a bit of a strange topic. Maybe I'll cover that in another video. If you want to see that, mention it in the comments, and maybe I'll get motivated to do it. So intention can be, well, I intend to avoid this thing, and avoiding things is generally easier than engaging in them. And you can't do it, right? You can't do it. So something's overriding your intent. And that's why separating intent and will and agency is important, right? It helps you to understand the world better. And that's why I think we're confused when we think of intent from the individualist perspective, right? Because individualism doesn't work well with the idea of intent. Because, again, often our intent isn't something we have enough control over to enact. And that's important to know. It's important to realize. It's important to realize if it's true for us, it's true for others. Look, individualism is a terrible thing. It can't exist. It's a bogus concept on its face. You weren't born an individual. You won't become an individual. You won't ever be an individual, and you won't ever have been an individual. I'm sorry. You were born into a world, and you are connected to all of the things of the world, and you require most of them, or some significant number of them. That's just the way it is. And so let's move on to will. Will is purely in your head, right? Much like intent, right? It's purely in your head. And this is kind of important, right? And that's why it's disconnected from action in the world. So you can will yourself to go to the gym and still fail, right? And will is about the ability to stick to or stay with your intent, right? It's also to make a choice, right? And so you may have an intention. Maybe that choice isn't up to you, right? Will, doesn't necessarily resolve that, right? And a will does connect our intent with our agency. It kind of sits in between them. Now, I know broader definitions are available, right? And you can swap those two pretty easily, but that actually doesn't work. And it'll become clear why. So let's just stick with this for now, right? Will allows us to override intent in some cases, right? And that's why you have the alcohol which requires work and agency, even when you don't intend to, right? This is actually really important. Oh, it's the will, right? It causes us to have the alcohol when we don't intend to drink anymore. Oh, interesting. It's almost like there's multiple parts of our psyche. Oh, psychology says that too. Weird. Okay, this is why I'm splitting the three apart, right? In this order. And some cases, will allows us to enact our intent. I mean, it's sitting between intent and agency, right? That which acts. That's what agency is, that which acts. It's the action, right? Agency doesn't exist in your head. Agency has to be able to be seen by others effectively. Like the effect has to be in the world, not just in your mind. Now, you'll notice there's a gap between intent and will. And that's important because one can override the other, right? Your intent can override your will to sort of be tired, right? You might will, your will is just tired, but you intend to do some work. And sometimes your intent will override your will and you'll do the work, right? And we don't always know what's overriding our will, and we don't always know what's overriding our intent. We just don't know, right? And will is highly subjective. But you'll notice that it's disconnected from action, just like our intent is. And sure, it's an influence, right? But it's not required. Because it can be overridden by your intent. And it's not the only, but it is an influence, right? But it's not the only influence. So it's an influence on what we do, just like intent, but it's not the only influence, right? And that's a significant consideration. Yeah, I want you to think about that very carefully because it's significant. And look, it's possible that perhaps you can only will yourself through so many things, say, in a day, right? Maybe there's a limit on will or free will. That's worth considering. Who knows, right? Perhaps will costs time, energy, and attention like everything else, which is why it's flakier than intent, right? Intent is much more clear. Will is not always clear. And will might get hijacked by a lack of energy and the need to act. So we do something, just not what we intended. I want to read a book. Reading a book's really hard. But you know what's not really hard? Watching TV. Much less effort than reading a book, especially for me because I'm dyslexic. Right? And then we satisfy our need to be doing things, right? And fail nonetheless. So just because you're not lazy doesn't mean you're useful. Or doing something useful. Or doing something worthwhile. Or doing something good. Doing something is good, sure, but doing randomly anything is not necessarily good. And that's where people get confused at things like that. And since I think we can't always enact our will, we'll say perfectly, we generally refer to this as willpower. And now you can see the confusion with power, right? Because there's intent. Intent is powerful. Sure, especially if you convey it to others and they pick it up. Oh, wait, you can enact your intent without invoking your will or your action. Why, yes. Yes, you can. You can do that with words sometimes or with actions. Ooh, interesting. And look, it's a pointless exercise to approach the world in a way that willpower is interesting or important, right? Like we're not going to have a grasp on that. That's not going to happen. They're going to be like, oh, we've learned the science of willpower, and now we can do this and have more willpower. It doesn't make any sense because will isn't perfect. So you're not actually solving a problem anyway, right? And again, there's this gap between will and agency, right? And so errors can happen there. just like they can between intent and will. Right? And you notice intent and will doesn't have to be in alignment for agency to happen. Right? You can have some intent, no will, and still get agency from yourself or others. Again, interesting, right? Your force of will can be sensed by others and enacted without any intent. Yeah, some people will drag you down the road of drinking even if you don't want to. Yeah, your will can be hijacked, right? And obviously, just because you intend something and you will it doesn't mean that in the gap, it won't get lost in your agency, because errors can happen in the gap. And maybe you can will yourself to the gym, right? Maybe you can will yourself to eat whatever food is part of that diet, right? Or avoid that alcohol. But when you cannot, what does that mean? What does that mean for our will and our intent? It means we don't know what we are up to quote Dr. Jordan Peterson. So I want you to think about this stuff carefully, because it matters a lot, right? Now, onward to agency. What is agency? How do we best sort of understand this? Well, agency isn't our ability to act in the world, right? It's when we change something outside of our mind. That's agency. If you didn't do the change, if the change didn't happen, you didn't have any agency. And you don't have any agency until it's exercised outside of you, right? There's no agency in thought. That's not the right way to think about it. There's no agency in choice, right? Making a choice does not give you agency, right? There's no agency in decision making. Okay. There's no agency in imagination. There's no agency there. It doesn't exist there. Right? Agency only comes when you alter the world outside of you. And it is limited, because the world outside of you cannot be altered any way that you wish. It cannot be altered according to your pure imagination. It cannot be altered with merely your will, or necessarily to conform to anything that your will desires, or your intent for that matter. Right? And so there's a limit on so-called free will. There's a limit to what your intent can enact in the world, right? Because there's a limit to your agency. Right? If you only have one leg, your agency is limited, right? Not fully, you still have some. And maybe the loss is so little that it doesn't really matter. I don't know. And we all have different amounts of agency, because we have different aspects in the world that we're not great at. Right? So some people are really physically fast. They have fast twitch nerve fiber. Some people are slow. That happens, right? Some people can jump really high and some can't. Some people are taller than others. Like, these are all changes of your agency, or your potential agency, right? And because agency comes from altering the world around you, right? It means that it's a good way to tell where you end and other things begin. If you're paying attention, just because you have agency doesn't mean you'll know where you end and other things begin. But that's important. The way you know is your agency. Your agency tells you, oh yeah, that there are limits to the world outside of your will and intent, outside of your mind, outside of your imagination, outside of what you can think. And here they are. That's the end of you and the beginning of something else. And you're not going to know that unless you exercise agency in the world. And then you'll find out where that is. And you'll find out how much agency you actually have. And you'll find out how to get more agency and when you can't get more agency, because there are hard limits somewhere. You want to call them natural laws, whatever. Make yourself happy. And your ability to change things outside the world determines the limits of your agency. It's that simple, right? And that is where the line is, where you end and other things begin. It's important to know that, because you're not the world, and the world is not you. And this is often why this confusion is often why you hear people go into pantheism, some flavor of pantheism. They'll differentiate the flavors so that they're special or something. But pantheism is pantheism, guys. I hate to break it to you. It's all the same drivel. It's not any different from any of the other pantheist, branches. It's all the same garbage. And it's really important that will is separate from agency, right? Because that's one type of sort of error, missing the mark, of sin, if you will. That's basically unintended consequences, right? And it gets explained by the separation of will and agency and by the limitation of agency, right? Because you can say maybe your will is not limited as much as your agency. That's almost certainly true, by the way. But your agency is limited. And so just because you can will something doesn't mean it's going to happen perfectly, because your agency isn't perfect. Your intention isn't perfect. Your will isn't perfect. Your agency isn't perfect. There's 3 gaps there. And so your agency to the world, who knows, right? And that's why you can't always throw the trash in the basket perfectly every time, although I do come close. Your will is not perfect. Your intent is not perfect. Your agency is not perfect. Your brain isn't always in perfect coordination with your body. Ever been sick? Ever had a cold? Well, why can't you just will that away? Can't use your agency to make the cold go away. You can use your agency to make your cold go away quicker, at least in theory. Seems to work, right? There's certain things you can do, right? But they're limited. The limitation of your agency. And that's the thing. The separation matters. Your intent doesn't always manifest. You can't always manifest your will. And, look, we should be thankful for that sometimes, because sometimes what we thought we were going to do would have ended up being a bad idea, and we happen to see it. And we go, oh, it's a good thing I didn't do that. Yeah. And what prevented you? Oh. Right. And so your agency is not merely your potential for action, or, that's in your head, right? Potential's in your head or in the future, but it's the action itself. The agency doesn't occur without the action. Right? Without action, there's no agency. Right? Without the world moving, there's no agency. No agency occurred. Right? And without the doing, you don't have anything. And nor does anyone else as a result of your thought. So unless something's done, unless there's an act in the world, no one has anything, including you. Right? Nothing outside of you changed at all. And maybe something inside of you changed, but no one's going to know, because if it doesn't manifest in action, the change to you is irrelevant. The world doesn't notice or care, because you can't change the world any differently through pure thought. It doesn't work. Right? What's in your pure thought is your intent and your will. Sure. And that's the thing, agency's not perfect, so you're not always going to get out of bed on time. You're not always going to be able to build what you need, much less what you want. And now, let me explain how this stuff matters. Let's look at how a confusion, even a minor confusion between any two of these concepts, but most likely all three, causes you to misapprehend the world, right? You take somebody like Paul Kingsnorth. He did this Erasmus talk. I'm not a particular fan of it. It was full of errors, first of all. I don't believe any of which were pushed back on, which, that's always a problem when people don't push back on obvious errors. And you say somebody says something, and if they didn't say that thing, it's kind of important to get that out of the way first. But be that as it may, he seems to think there's a machine forcing things to happen, or running things, or causing effects in the world. And the confusion is that while machines have agency, right? They get their intent and their will, or power, willpower, if you will, power. Remember my definition of power, please, because that actually might be relevant here. They get that from people, right? Power is just focus, time, energy, and attention, right? You focus your time, energy, attention towards a goal or a telos, hopefully. That's power. How much you have is a different question. You can't necessarily increase it, right? You can leverage your power, right? You can magnify your power with a machine, but the machine doesn't have the power. It's just a lever, right? Technology is just a lever. It's a magnifier. So it's the people that move the machine. Now, if the machine is being used to move other people or to move things a certain way, and that forces other people to move a certain way, that's fine, but it does change his point, right? Because if you don't like where the machine is going, maybe don't dismantle the machine, maybe hijack the machine, right? Or uncorrupt the machine so it's going in a better place. That's the right answer, right? Revivification is the right answer, not destruction. Not, oh, this thing is bad because I don't like what it's doing, right? It's bad because it has agency and it's enacting that agency in the world. No, it's bad because of the power directed at the wrong place, right? It's time, energy, and attention being directed in the wrong place, causing the machine to do something that isn't to your liking. Now, it's also possible the machine's doing the right thing, and the fact that you don't like it is because you're a big fat crybaby, and it's just too bad. Like, that's also possible. So I'm not saying that's true. I don't know. I don't know what you're complaining about necessarily. I don't know what Paul Kingsnor's machine is. I'm not going to look into it. I'm really not that interested. But you can see the confusion, right? Like, if I'm right and you tear down the machine and we need the machine, then we're all screwed. This is part of the plot of the Matrix trilogy, by the way. I forget if it's in 2 or 3, but it's in one of them. I think it's probably in 3. But yeah, I mean, we developed machines because we needed them. Maybe we've developed machines we don't need, but let's figure that out first, right? And we're not going to figure that out if we think that the machine has intent, will, and agency all on its own, because it doesn't, right? Because then the only option is that it is in fact an enemy and it must be destroyed. That would be true, but that's not true of machines, right? So Skynet, big psyop is the summary there. And the thing is, the fact that the machine's agency has consequences that we don't expect or understand means that we're imperfect builders of machines, right? And maybe not all machines, but maybe most machines. I mean, maybe, you build the machine of the plastics industry. I'm just going to, go with grand sort of meta, if you will, machines, right? Like these machines outside of what we think of a simple machine as, right? And then we find out, 30 or 40, maybe it's been 50 or 60, 70 years now, I don't know, later, that plastics get into everything, and now we have a microplastics problem. Well, that's an unintended, unforeseen consequence of the plastics machine. Plastics have a lot of advantages to us, so it's hard to kind of tell, was this trade-off good? I mean, you're always ingesting something, right? You're always ingesting lead or arsenic or some sort of industrial component, even before the industrial age, by the way, so don't be thinking industry is the problem here. And so what does that mean? Well, it means there's trade-offs and unintended consequences from the machines because they have agency, just as there are from our own agency. We don't know all the things that we cause when we act in the world. And we can't know that because there's this huge gap. There's a gap of information and therefore a gap of knowledge. We don't know the world well enough to know, where does that string attach to, right? This is the Chesterton's fence problem, roughly speaking. It's a little more complex than that, I would say, but Chesterton's fence is the basics, gets it pretty dead on, right? You don't know why that's there. You don't know what that's for. If you don't know what it's for, you shouldn't touch it, right? You figure out what it's there for first. And in the age of gnosis, where knowledge is propositions and the highest value, you would think we would want to know before we act. But actually, the opposite is true, right? Because we're privileging new flat knowledge, certain knowledge, right? A concrete knowledge over the knowledge of relationships, the poetic information of the world, how things are connected, how they're multiply connected to multiple things. And that's why that gap of agency is important, because it's always going to be there, because your information is never going to be perfect, right? And therefore, you can't quite accurately predict from your agency, especially as your agency gets larger or more leveraged or further away from you, exactly what's going to happen, because the world is bigger than you are. The world's bigger than I am. The world's bigger than you and all of you, my dear viewers and listeners, combined, in fact. Oh, who saw that coming? Right? And that's why you should not attribute will or intent to machines or systems, right? Clearly, machines can take actions. Systems can take action. Of course they can, right? But they don't have will or intent. Government might intend to help the poor and end up making it worse for the poor. They might intend to end homelessness and just not be able to do it, because maybe homelessness isn't a problem. It's not a disease. It's not a thing to be solved. It's a symptom of any number of problems. And therefore, you'd have to fix any number of problems, which you should first identify, by the way, before homelessness could go away. But maybe you can't fight it directly because it's a symptom. And you can't fight symptoms directly in all cases. Sorry. Maybe the folks in government might intend to make the government better, right? But maybe they get their will to make the government better broken down by the bureaucracy. Or worse, they try to make the government better, but another agent turns their good work into corruption. That's even worse. Oh my, what are we to do? That could happen, right? And maybe you want to blame your conditions on the psychic space dragon of capitalism. But capitalism is not a psychic space dragon that is running around affecting your life. That's a bad way to think about capitalism. Maybe you should check out this video if you want to know more. Maybe it doesn't have that level of agency that you're attributing to it. Maybe that's not what's happening. Maybe whatever's interfering with your intent and your will and your ability to act is the problem. Maybe that's the problem. And you know what? If that's the problem, it's fixable, right? Or at least it can be made better. Let's focus on that. Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the better, because that's a big problem. And the thing is, with systems, with machines, with governments, with institutions, right? Those are all above us in the scale, right? They're a higher scale, right? A system is multiple people. An institution is multiple people. They're multiple people cooperating in a specific way. To build most machines, it requires more than one person. You say, well, I can buy gears on Amazon. Who made the gears? Who got the shipping done? Who did the logistics? You're not making machines by yourself for the most part. And when you are, they're small machines and they don't have a huge effect. They don't scale. Right. And that, my friends, is why scale matters, why hierarchy matters, and why we cannot understand those higher things without first having a healthy appreciation for these other concepts, for our personal direct interaction with intent, will, and agency. And you have to really pay attention to that, because that is where you need to focus yourself. Not on these other higher things. You're not going to do anything about them, especially if you're not good with your own intent, will, and agency and controlling that. You don't know what you're up to. Not all the time. And even when you do, what happened as the result of what you were up to? I mean, this is how narcissism manifests. You think you know what you're doing in the world, and it turns out you're just selfish. You're twisting everybody around you, and you don't even know it. You're arrogant. You're making assumptions that you know other people by the things you see about them on the internet. That's just narcissism. That's not parasocial relationship. That's a garbage term. That's just you being narcissistic. Really, that's all it is. Sorry. Hate to break it to you. Now, the thing you need to get control over first is a sense of intent, will, and agency, right? And that starts with recognizing the most valuable thing you have, which I value very greatly, your time and attention.